want to be talking about this evening is the 2/7 chord, but being used in a different position. And in particular, what we're interested in doing it is moving it out of that root position and exploring the possibilities for uses of 2/7, the Supertonic Seventh, in inversions. The piece of music I was just playing was by a great American composer, Scott Joplin, who wrote a lot of wonderful music a little over a century ago. Joplin is a real favorite for music theory teachers because he uses all sorts of conventional harmonies in absolutely wonderful ways, and he's a great source of examples for us. The piece that I was just playing for you is an excerpt from one of the rags that he wrote called Solace, and this is in the middle of the piece. It doesn't begin there. The reason why I'm playing it for you is twofold. First of all, there's a particular example I want to get to this evening. Also, what I'm interested in doing is setting us up for discussion later on in this course. In particular, what we're going to be interested in is the use of submediant and mediant harmonies as substitutions for the tonic, and we're going to derive that from this piece as well. But what we're interested in tonight is the Supertonic Seventh, and this piece begins, it's in the key of F major. That's tonic harmony. That's submediant harmony. That means a D minor triad. And what we have right there, in my right hand I'm playing a 2/7 chord that happens to be in root position, which is nice because you can hear the whole thing. But what is giving me the position for the chord is actually what's in the bass. It's the third of the chord. So once again, if it's got the third of the chord in the bass, that means it's a 2/6/5 chord. So where do we go from there? 1, 6, 2, 6, 5. Suspension. 5 chord, 5/7 chord. That might remind us of our wonderful tonic 7th chord. It's a major 7th chord. Okay? There's a lot we're going to be able to get out of this passage. So if it's good enough for Joplin, it should be good enough for us. Why don't we start to explore the use of the Supertonic 7th in that particular position? One thing I want you to note is that if I have a key like F major being used, if I play the Supertonic 7th in that first inversion, with the third in the bass, it sounds kind of like chord 4 with an added sixth on top. I mean, literally what's on top, of course, is the root of the triad. But this is why often the 2/6/5 chord is heard as a chord of the added sixth. What's especially interesting about that, you might remember in the previous video, I was talking about how Rameau is really interested in the kind of exchangeability of the supertonic and the subdominant. That really comes to the fore if we're working with 2/7 in first inversion, because literally the position is subdominant harmony, and then it's as if you've added the sixth onto it, okay? So this is a chord that once again is trying to pretend very much as though it were a subdominant harmony, with the third being given to us in the bass, right? So what I want to do now is break down the use, not just of 2/6/5, but also I want us to look at 2/4/3 and also 2/4/2. So all the standard inversions of 7th chords that we're already familiar with from the dominant 7th. And again, what I want to emphasize is the fact that, look, if we've already covered this in terms of the dominant 7th, then basically we already know what we're doing when we're working with 2/7. So what we're going to be doing is applying a lot of the same voice leading models and ideas that we're already familiar with. Okay, so we're back now. And what I've tried to do is, I've been trying to do in all of these videos, is pack my examples into a tight little space so that you can see everything as clearly as possible. I'm also shooting in corresponding version of HD, 30 frames per second. I'm hoping then that if you see this on a larger screen, you can see the details clearly enough, okay? So I want to point out a couple of things to start out with, and that is we have in our textbook these progressions being set in a number of different keys. Sometimes I want to put them all in the same key just to show how you can work with a particular format and just change out some of the components, all right? So what I'm going to be doing right here is setting things up for, in particular, the use of Supertonic Seventh in first inversion, that's a 2-6-5 chord, and Supertonic Seventh in second inversion, so that would be a 2-4-3 chord. And what you're going to see me doing is working with, you guessed it once again, our basic 1-5-1 progression, set up as we've always done for progression, 3, root, 3rd, 5th on top. And what I want to be able to do, if it's at all possible, is to retain this fundamental voice leading. So I'm going to be doing two types of chord progressions, the 2-6-5 to 5, the 2-4-3 to 5. I'm saving the 2-4-2 for later on because necessarily I wouldn't be able to use progression 3 for that. I can't go from a 2-4-2 chord to a chord 5 in root position because the 7th of the 2 chord needs to resolve downwards by step. If it's in the bass, it's going to be resolving to the 3rd of chord 5. That means it's going to have to be in first inversion. So we'll see that later on. But what I have right here at the bottom of the board is a couple of things. The basic progression that we're working with, I haven't put in the 1 chord at the end, but we're going from tonic chord to subdominant function to the 5 chord. Although we're going to be working with inversions, what I've done is I've placed just the full-on 2 half diminished 7th try because we're going to be working things out in the key of G minor as though it were in root position so that we can see that. And there's one core thing that I want you to notice to start out with, and that is that if I go from chord 1 to 2-7 and from 2-7 to 5, there will be common tones, which is to say that some component of the previous chord will be transmuted into a new component of the next, and I want to be able to hang on to that whenever I can. It's like a kind of through line I can grab onto in my voice leading. So first of all, if I look at 1 and 2-7, I notice that the doubled root, one of those components will become the 7th of 2-7, as we've seen before. Also, if I'm moving from 2-7 to 5, because this is root progression by 5th, if I go up a 5th from the dominant, well, what I'm getting is the root of 2-7. So what that means is that what was a root will turn into a 7th, and what was a root will turn into a 5th. So there'll be those 2 transformations from root to 7th, from root to 5th. So it's always starting from a root and then moving to some new component of the other chord, the 7th, the 5th. And then the thing to keep in mind is that basic model for resolving 7th chords that we learned about before that we could apply immediately and easily with inversions of dominant 7ths. So if I look at the idea of the 7th chord resolving to something else, in this case 2-7 chord to a 5 chord, the usual things are happening. The so-called tendency tones are resolving as we would expect, the 3rd rising, the 7th falling. And then what that means is that the 5th will also fall because I don't want to double up on the 3rd of 5 under ordinary circumstances. And I have the possibility for a common tone here. And remember, when we move to 7th chords in inversions, this is something that we can make use of all the time, right? Because we're not actually going from a root position 2-7 chord to a root position chord 5. So I can just hang on to that, all right? So if I take this idea and that idea and I put them together, what I become aware of is that if I have something in place here, that doubled root, which turns into 7th, I already know that this 7th will be resolving where I need to go, down to the 3rd of chord 5, right? And likewise, this root can just hang on and resolve in regular fashion. So if I have a framework of progression 3, a 1-5-1 around this, everything in a sense should already be in place. So the first thing that I'm going to do then is consider the idea of what Joplin was using, which was a 2-6-5. Now, in his case, that particular harmony, because I was in a major key, the 2-6-5 is not a half diminished 2-6-5. That's just a regular minor 7th chord. If I go into a minor key, of course, what I'm going to be getting is half diminished 7th. So if I go here, I want to note straight away that 2 half diminished 6/5 is what I'm going to be working with. So I'm going to plug that into my A, B, and C versions. So that's all in place for me. Now, what I want to watch out for is two things. First of all, I want to be able to grab hold of this thing, which is going to be turning into the 7th, chord 7. So I'm going to be looking for that doubled root. And then what I'm hoping to see is this thing ending up being very close to this thing over here, all right? So if I look at these models, the first thing I can notice is that indeed, if I hung onto that, that doesn't sound very good. If I hang on to that, this actually is already in place to do exactly what it should. So there's that common tone motion, and that will resolve the way I would expect. That's going to be true for all of these models, right? So something crucial has already taken place. The 7th has been correctly set up, resolved correctly. So what I already have in this progression are the two tendency tones behaving exactly as they should. 7th falling, 3rd rising. 7th falling, 3rd rising. 7th falling, 3rd rising, okay? So if that's in place, that's wonderful. The next thing that I need to think about is, okay, what else am I going to need to come up with a complete 2/7 chord? So I've got already these components in place. I need the root and the 5th. So we're talking about the pitches A and E, right? So in all of these cases, there are interesting things that I can do that will kind of set things up later on. Once again, if I'm thinking about the possibility of common tones, I kind of like to take care of business here first. I know that that thing can connect directly with the 5th of chord 5. So that root I should be able to place based on where I see the 5th of chord 5. So I see a 5th of chord 5 here, an A already in place there. And that is something that I could find presumably in all of these locations. Right. And over here, noting that it's an inside voice. That's already in place. And so the one thing I have to finish off with is the 5th of chord 2/7. In this case, it's going to be an E flat. And again, what I'm hoping to see is that thing resolve downwards by step to the root of chord 5. So there's another root of chord 5 that's a perfect position for that E flat, the 5th of 2 half diminished 6/5. Same thing here. And of course, same thing here, right? And for those of you who aren't familiar with my method of notating things, this is a keyboard scoring for the most part. However, what I tend to do is not draw my stems all the way through, just so I can show these connections in between. Okay, so in every case, I'm building inwards from progression 5. So I'll play progression 5 first, the A version, the B version, the C version. Remember, the A version has the root in the soprano place. The B version has starts with the 3rd. The C version starts with the 5th. So I'm going for this basic pattern. And so now if I go for my 2 half diminished 6/5 in the middle of that, and if I wanted to, I could actually hang on to the common tone. Kind of like doing that sometimes because it gives it that sound character of being like a kind of suspension effect, right? And we'll notice that a lot more when we've got something like that in the bass. Remember, this is the 7th of the 2/7 chord. When it goes into the bass, common tone with the root of tonic harmony preceding it, it's going to sound really cool. I'll try this one once again, 1-5-1. So now I'll go for the 2-6-5 in the middle of it. 1, 5, 1, the C version. Okay, I think these two half diminished 6, 5 sound absolutely wonderful, and that's one reason why I'm actually giving you all of these example in a minor key. I just think they sound so awesome because that is that half diminished seventh sound quality, which has a kind of friction to it. It really gives us a sense of wanting to drive forward as a predominant to the dominant harmony itself. And I want to emphasize that in particular today because the last example that I'm going to be giving is actually in the context of a major key. That's going to be coming from a bit of music for Princess Leia in one of the Star Wars movies. And what's cool about that is that even though the main tune itself is in a major key, the composer, John Williams, decides to pretend for a moment when he goes to a 2/7 chord, he pretends for a moment that he's gone into D minor, and it's going to be a lovely effect. So we're actually going to be running with this idea of the 2 half diminished seventh through all of these examples today. Okay, so those sound very nice. Let's see if we can apply some of these same ideas to a slightly different position. I'm going to now, instead of working with 2 half diminished 6, 5, I managed to hang on to that diminished symbol. I'm going to instead be going for 2 half diminished 4, 3. And just so that the voice leading sounds especially nice, I can do it like that. It can also be kind of fun to start up here and just have this sense of a nice descent downwards. So I'll do that for a couple of these things. And then the last one I'll leave as originally there so you can hear what that thing sounds like. And then once again, what I want to do, just to start things out on a fresh path, is get rid of the work that I've done before, clean that out, because of course I would have parallel octaves if I left that in place. And that, for a variety of reasons, as we already know, is a no-no. Whoop, I have to get rid of that parallel octave. Okay, so once again, I want to grab hold of the things that I know will work. So I know that I can look for a common tone, and when I've got that in place, that seventh that comes out of that should turn into the third or leading tone of chord 5. And so once again, that's something I can grab hold of immediately. And there's the resolution that I'm looking for. The same thing is still there. See, we already know how to do this. And likewise, over here, that is already in place. So I've taken care of that bit of business. I'm also really interested in grabbing hold of something obvious, the root of 2 half diminished seventh chord turning into the fifth of chord 5. So I'm looking for an A, and that is available to me already once again. Put that in place. This is already available to me there. And then the last thing again that I'm looking for, in this case, remember what has been taken care of is not the third. That's when we were going from 2, 6, 5 to 5. In this case, the fifth has already been taken care of. It's already doing what it's supposed to. What I really need to have is the third of the chord. So this tendency tone has to be rising up to what should be one of the doubled roots of chord 5. And so I already am going to have 5 in the bass because the root of chord 5 in the bass, because it's a root position dominant chord. So wherever else I find a D, I should already be in a position to get there from a nearby C, which I am right there, which I am right here, and which I am right here. I'll shift that just a little to the side, like so. So once again, what I'll do to start out with is play the 1-5-1, and then instead of doing 2 half diminished 6-5, I'm going to do 2 half diminished 4-3. So 1-5-1. Of course, I could also do. But I'm not going to do that because I would end up just repeating this pattern an octave down. All right, so first one, sorry. So once again, I'm going to listen, especially for the A version, to that kind of suspension effect. So once again. The B version. And finally, so once again, we're really enjoying the richness of the half diminished seventh sonority. And in a way, when you play around with it in inversions, the kind of friction within it tends to be emphasized even more. What this might remind us of then, of course, is that idea of the Phrygian progression that we learned about before, 4-6-5, only in a minor key. And of course, I'm not going to go back over again why it's called a Phrygian progression there, but we're getting that same idea in this particular set of examples. The next thing that I want to do, though, is move ahead to 2 half diminished 4-2. And I am going to redraw the board because what I want to do is set up another piece of music for us later on. So from G minor, I'm going to move us over to the key of D minor. Okay, so I'll do the redrawing and I'll set up a couple more examples, and then we'll be able to finish looking at all of the inversions of 2 half diminished seventh chords. The one thing I want to point out is that in all of these cases, you might remember when we were working with dominant sevenths in inversions, the beauty of that was that we could always work with a complete seventh chord resolving to a complete 1 chord. So we didn't have to think about type 1 resolution, type 2 resolution, type 3 resolution. That's the beauty of dominant sevenths in inversions. Well, it's the beauty of any seventh chord in inversions. Everything that we're working with is complete. There's going to be one change, though, when I do the 2 half diminished 4-2 going to a dominant harmony. In that case, as we know, so often we actually have not just the 5 chord, but a 5-7 chord. And so if you think about the previous video that I posted, where I was just talking about 2-7 in root position, one of the things that we did earlier in that video was look at what starts to happen if you move from one 7th chord to another 7th chord, if their root position is a 5th part. So what I'm going to do for the next set of chord progressions is actually go from a 2 half diminished 4-2 directly to a chord of the dominant 7th in its first inversion. So we'll see that next. So we're back. I've reset the board, and the first thing I want you to notice is that unlike the previous progressions, I can't frame this in terms of progression 3. I can't go 1-5-1 because in this case, what I'm explicitly interested in is the idea of the Supertonic Seventh in its third inversion. Examples that I've given to you of this before have also been in the key of D minor. The one that I always like to play is from the Bach Chaconne in D minor for solo violin, where you have tonic harmony. That's the 2 half diminished 7th chord with the 7th in the bass. So what we notice, and it's being written out for us right here, is the fact that if I have tonic harmony and supertonic 7th, of course I have the common tone, as we've already seen, between the doubled root and the 7th of 2-7. If this chord is in fact in its third inversion and the 7th is in the bass, that means that the bass note is going to be held like a common tone. And as we move from this to that and the tremendous dissonance that we get there, it's going to again give it that quality of a suspension that we're going to want to hear resolving as forcefully as possible to chord 5 in its first inversion. But the difference now between the other examples and this one isn't just the fact that we're going to chord 5 in its first inversion. I'm taking us directly to a 5-7 chord in first inversion, a 5-6-5. And the reason why I want to do that is I want to pick up on one of these things that we looked at in the previous video where we move from one 7th chord to another and we see components of these chords, significant ones, trading places as it were before they resolve. So in terms of the voice leading models that we're interested in, a different set of common tones is coming into play. To start out with, the doubled root will remain common tone with the 7th of 2-7, but note here I've got two common tones. The reason for that is, of course, the root of 2-7 is common tone with the 5th of chord 5 dominant harmony, but if I'm actually using a dominant 7th, the 3rd turns into the 7th of 5-7, and then that 5-7 should resolve correctly, okay? So let's see how that plays out. The first thing that I want to do always is keep track of the common tone going from 1 to 2-7. That is already in place in all of these three examples. That's for something a little bit later on when we talk about cadential 6/4s. That is already in place. The next thing that I want to keep track of is how I go from the 2/2 diminished 7 to 5/7. Now, once again, it's the voice leading model, the standard one, tendency tones, 3rd up, 7th down, 5th also goes down, that I want to keep track of, and the possibility for this common tone, the root turning into the 5th. So keep in mind, of course, that the 7th has already been resolving correctly. The 3rd of the chord is going to be a G, and that is something that should turn into, crucially, the 7th of 5-7, and I want to see that thing resolving downwards by step to the 3rd of chord 1. So that's the first thread that I'm going to grab onto. Do I see some place where I want to end up if I'm going from a dominant 7th in some position, even if it's 5-6-5? So I'm looking for the 3rd of chord 1 in all of these cases, and I see it there, I see it there, and I see it here. So that is going to be the 7th of 5-7 going downwards by step. So these are my two tendency tones. They are in place. That's the positioning that I'm hoping to end up in. The next thing that I want to do, of course, is back this thing up, because apparently this is supposed to be the 3rd of chord 2/2 diminished 7 before. So I've got this thing that I want to put there in all of these cases. So that's going to be in place. Now, with these kinds of components available to me, I have some choices that I can make. Again, what I'm interested in doing is finding out the neatest and simplest way I can keep track of these things. The tendency tones are especially important for me. So the 7th has already been taken care of. The 3rd, remember, is not resolving like a tendency tone would anymore. It's turning into a different tendency tone in a different chord where it resolves correctly. So I'm just looking for the common tone connection between the root of 2/2 diminished 7 and the 5th of chord 5. So I'm looking for that available E, and then who knows where that E is going to go. And then I also want to have the 5th of chord 2/2 diminished 7, and that thing should be going down to the root of chord 5, right? So what I'm looking for is smooth place to find my B flat and another place to put my E. So I'm going to go for the 5th, because that is in a 2/2 diminished 7 setting. It's going to be a diminished 5th. That's really going to want to resolve down to an A. And one thing I would like to be able to do, if you might remember, if I have my 5-7 set up like this, resolving in an inversion to chord 1, I know that I can have that common tone in place, right? So if that's the case, then I'm looking to have my A here. There's that common tone. I want that B flat just behind it, all right? I'll work my way through this entire progression first rather than filling them each in by spot. I wanted to grab hold of the key outlining things that I can hang on to first, but now I want to fill them out. So I've got everything in place except for my root of this chord. And so obviously the one place for that is up there. So you have this interesting thing happening. And of course, by the way, this is then going to, I'll try to position this over here. This turns into the 5th of 5, 6, 5, so that goes downward by a step. What I'm noticing is that things seem to be staying in place, and then something pulls away, and this thing feels like it's out of place and needs to go downward. So because these components are staying in place, it rather sounds like this is a suspension being resolved. So I'll play that for you, and what I'm going to do is just hang on to the bass part. So it almost sounds like a double suspension, but you really get that sense of the power of 2 half diminished 4 2. A la Bach, okay? All right, so I want to see if I can't do the same kind of thing in these other places. And again, what I'm looking for is this the B flat, the diminished 5th. That's so important that it's going down by semitone to this A, and that A is going to be common tone over there. So I want to get that thing in place first, okay? There it is, and then likewise shift up here, the common tone. So I'm seeing this double common tone pattern running throughout because I've moved to a 7th chord, and again, it's going to sound rather like a suspension. Play that one for you. Very cool. And then down here, I stepped it down. You'll note in your textbook that because we're working there in the example with a major key, you can, of course, do 2 4 2 chords in a major key. They sound all right. They're just not quite as harmonically thrilling if you put them in a major key. But one thing that you have to watch out for is imagine I were doing this in a major key. Again, I want that. In a minor key, this is that diminished 5th. It's going to be resolving downwards by stuff like that. I really want to hear that in place. Okay? And in all of these circumstances, I have to start watching out for something in particular. Actually, I need to stick this in here. If this were a major key, I would see 2 things that look like this. Now we know in a minor key, it only counts as perfect parallels if in fact both of the intervals are perfect ones. In a minor key, that's not the case. That's a perfect 5th, that's a diminished 5th, that's that special sound quality that we're looking for in the half diminished 2/7 chord. If it were in the major though, I just want to make sure that's clear that you can really see that. If I were to play this in major, first I'll play it for you in minor so you can hear once again how cool it sounds. Now, if I were in major, again, on a piano with the decay that it has, you can often get away with perfect parallel 5ths. It's not a great thing. It's never a great thing if one component of the parallel 5th is in an exterior voice, like soprano and inside part right next to it. But regardless, it's sounding a little bit lame if you have instruments that play with sustained pitch, you know, singers, brass instruments, what have you. The parallel fifths will really sound lousy. So what our textbook actually does is kind of a cheat that you'll see. It hops up here and then jumps back down again, as if that is going to disguise the underlying perfect parallel. So it does this. And honestly, that just sounds silly, especially this thing not being in a metrically prominent position. It's going to sound like you're trying to fake getting away from perfect parallels. So generally, it's just not a particular progression I would use in major. Instead, what I would do is just say, okay, you want to do major? Then start major from here. All right, and down you go, okay? But in minor, this works just right, because that's the diminished fifth. So I can, of course, play these for you in major so you can hear what they sound like. So the minor is, and in major, it sounds okay. The next one in minor, in major, I don't feel as strong a desire to turn it into a quasi-suspension. I just feel like it actually sounds better that way. And we've already played through that. Now, there is going to be one special thing I will show you in a moment, which is in the key of D major, and which is using a 2 half diminished 4/2, but I'll get to that at the end of this little video. What I want to show you right now is something that's on the next page, page 243. You'll see there are a lot of examples there that deal with moving from a 2/7 to a 5/7, and that's all about this transmutation, the third of 2/7 turning into the seventh of 5/7 and then resolving correctly. We've already covered that with this example, so I thought I don't need to go through those additional examples. It's this principle in place. That's why I did it here, okay? The one thing that we hadn't looked at was the use of a cadential 6/4 with a 2 approach to it. So remember, we can only use a cadential 6/4 if it's followed by chord 5 in root position. Therefore, what we need to remind ourselves of is I can't use one particular inversion of the Supertonic Seventh. I can't use the third inversion because necessarily by definition that takes me to dominant harmony in first inversion. I can't use that. But what I can use is 2/7 itself. And what I want you to notice here is that in this case, I don't recall if the textbook does it or not, but this is where it's saying, hey, remember the fact that before we were dealing with seventh chords and root positions, we had these different types of resolutions. One thing that made different types possible for us were having incomplete triads. If we have a seventh chord, the easy thing to do is just to knock out the fifth. So what is being given to us there is actually an incomplete 2/7 chord, all right? Remember all of the other inversions that we were working with, we were always doing those in minor, and I never had to worry about whether it was actually a half diminished supertonic seventh or not, because since they were all in inversions, I could use complete supertonic sevenths. Therefore, if I was in a minor key, the diminished fifth was always there. It was always half diminished. If I were doing this in a minor key, and I'm using an incomplete 2/7 chord, dropping the diminished fifth, and it wouldn't be a 2 half diminished seventh. It would just be a 2 minor seventh. But we're in a major key, and I'm leaving out that fifth. And what I want you to notice is that I'm hopping over this, okay? That is the cadential 6/4. Remember, whenever we want to build a quick and easy cadential 6/4, all we need to do is have a chord in one position and go from the root up to the fifth, and right away you've got the doubled fifth that you need for a chord in the second inversion, and then away you go, right? So that was always this basic idea. All right, so now what we want to do is see if we can put in a supertonic seventh before that. What I want to remind us of is the fact that, all right, once again, if I'm going from tonic harmony to my 2/7 chord, I'm always going to be looking for the availability of that common tone, all right? And so I want to see the doubled root of chord 1 turning into the 7th of chord 2/7, which then should be resolving to the 3rd of chord 5. So that was the basic model that we were working with in all of our other progressions. The confusing thing here is that we're going through the cadential 6/4 first. So there's a way in which we don't immediately see that kind of resolution. But if I go back to that idea of looking for the common tone, well, I want this thing, right, the 7th of chord 2, to resolve to the 3rd of chord 5. If I ignore the cadential 6/4 that's in the middle, I look on either side, I can go, right, that 7th actually does resolve downwards by step as I would like. Correspondingly, the root of chord 2/7, which can be common tone with the 5th of chord 5, so C turning into a C, the 5th of chord 5, if I go from here over to there, what do I see? But again, if I hop over that common tone is precisely there. And then finally, I'm looking for the 3rd of 2/7. Yeah, and in this case, what am I doing with? No, I just hope that you can see that as clearly as possible. I want that 3rd going up to the root of chord 5. So I've got my tendency tones behaving the way they should. That over there, that there, 7th down, 3rd up, that's in place. So if I just do the 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1, and then I put in my 2/7 thinking about things the way I usually do, I find that I get exactly the voice leading that I need. So I kind of pretend that isn't there, although it already is, because I know how to put it in place. And this thing, I imagine moving from there directly to there. So if I were to leave out the cadential 6/4, I would do this. So that sounds perfectly good. You can hear how the cadential 6/4 fits in hand in glove in the middle of all of that. Next thing that I want to put in place is this 2/6/5. And now I will not be working with anything incomplete, because I don't need to do that anymore. And you can see from this voice leading, I mean, I had the doubled root before. Well, I've got the root up there. I want that root to become common tone with the 5th of chord 5. Maybe I can just leave that thing in place. But what I don't have is the 5th of the chord. And the 5th is something that I want going down to the root of chord 5 over here. So I can just tuck that in there. Boom, I'm already done. And so once again, I'll play the progression without the cadential 6/4, which sounds just lovely. Awesome. That's taken care of. And of course, the last one that I want to be able to do is 2/2 diminished 4/3. Sorry, I'm in the major key, not half diminished 4/3. Did too many minor key examples. I don't want those parallel octaves. I have to get rid of that. And so the component that I'm missing now, of course, is the 3rd, which should be rising up to the root over here. Put that in place there. And again, if you leave that out, you can see how this resolution works out exactly going from there over there. So once again, I will leave out the cadential 6/4. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to leave out the cadential 6/4. I couldn't resist putting in. Which I think sounds lovely. Now I'll put in the 2, 4, 3. Okay? So these are all the versions that you see one by one in your textbook. I think it's much more helpful to just put in the one progression, 1, cadential 6, 4, 5, 7 to 1, and then just trade out the particular chord positions that you're working with in the middle. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do is talk about the fact that all of these progressions have been working with this idea, namely going from tonic function chord to subdominant function chord to dominant function chord and back to tonic function chord again. However, one of the things I've also been suggesting for quite some time now is the idea that sometimes you can have dominance of other chords, like a dominant of a dominant. And that was where we got our initial voice leading model for the Supertonic Seventh from, imagining as though we'd gone into the key of the dominant, tendency, tones resolving as they should, that kind of thing. And one of the things I said about it was that, well, it's so powerful, especially if you have it in a minor key, that it can kind of sound almost like a dominant function chord. Now, one thing that we learned about when we were first introduced to chord function was the fact that this sort of pattern is okay. This, say a T, S, T, tonic, subdominant, 2 tonic, would be okay if and only if that subdominant were actually chord 4 in root position. And that's a pretty standard chord progression. So if I were, for example, in the key of D major, that is a 1, 4, 1, sounds a-okay to me. But what we're told is that, well, subdominant function only if it's 4, but good heavens, you would never want to use chord 2 to do that. Fair enough. But what if chord 2 could actually have a dominant function? So what I want to play for you is just part of a tune. It's something like a Princess Leia theme, I'm not quite sure, a love theme, by the composer John Williams for the original Star Wars trilogy. And what's really striking about it is how John Williams decides, you know, if I'm in a major key, which is what I want because it speaks to the warmth and spirit of Princess Leia, that sort of thing, that's nice, but maybe just for a moment I could pretend that I'm going into the key of D minor. And if I can do that, the contrast, the sort of mixture of modes that's taking place might do something interesting, possibly even magical, to the use of chord 242. So remember that a Supertonic Seventh is, ordinarily speaking, supposed to be subdominant in function, going back to remote, going back to the previous video that I did. Now, if I play this tune, and by the way, I apologize for the fact that it's on a piano. It's one of the great French horn melodies of all time, and probably some of you will recognize it if you can imagine a French horn playing this. It's key of D major. Unfortunately, it really does sound lame on the piano. It sounds fantastic with a proper orchestra. What John Williams is doing is saying, okay, I've got this lovely tune of a rising sixth. This is tonic harmony. That is the sound of modal mixture. That's where we might be in one mode, and for a moment we're pretending we've gone into the parallel mode, the parallel major or the parallel minor. So I'm in D major, and if I were to actually go to a 2-7 chord in the key of D major, what I would get is that, you know, which is a very nice chord as well. But notice what happens when you actually pretend for a moment you've gone into D minor. All of a sudden, you get a kind of musical magic coming out of that modal mixture. And Then this wonderful thing happens where what John Williams does is he's moving up to this B flat that you get. That's that diminished fifth of the to half diminished seventh chord, and then he's imagining that as the fifth of some weird major chord that's actually Neapolitan harmony. So you might remember from earlier in this course the idea that, let's say I was in something like B flat major. No, sorry, I'm going to stick with the key I'm in. D major. Chord 2 ought to be this thing, right? If, however, I imagine myself to be building a triad on a chromatic scale degree, flat 2, and turning it into a major quality chord, that is something that we know of as Neapolitan harmony. Usually where you come across that, of course, is in a minor mode, and our example of that in the course before this was from that Chopin waltz you might remember. So that was in the key of B minor, C major triad in first inversion. All right, so that's where we encountered it before. And what John Williams is doing is saying, well, I'm having so much fun working with this idea that I can move between different mode types. Well, let's see where my modulations can take me. So there's a wonderful example of a Neapolitan harmony coming up in the context of a major key, which was prepared by modal mixture. John Williams' compositions are just as interesting as Scott Joplin's, who I began this video with. So I hope that some of these kinds of chords that we've been listening to today and learning about are things that will ring a bell for you, that you'll be able to start recognizing them in popular movie scores and pop tunes and things like that you've heard. So thank you very much, and I think probably for the next video what I will do is go over the idea of altered dominance, because I had a couple of questions about that from the previous video. So thanks very much again.